There's a pattern that governments follow when they're desperate, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. It shows up in ancient Rome when emperors started sheaving the edges off silver coins. It shows up in Weimar Germany when the printing presses ran day and night. And it showed up in the United States in the 1930s in one of the most brazen acts of financial theft ever committed against the American people, an act that most people have either forgotten or were never taught about in school. What happened in 1933 and 1934 is not ancient history. It is a blueprint. And the conditions that made it possible the first time around are not just similar to what we're seeing today, they are almost identical. So let me take you back, not in a dry textbook kind of way. I want you to feel what it was like to be an ordinary American during that era, because the emotional reality of what happened is what makes the modern parallel so chilling. It's the spring of 1933. The country is in absolute free fall. Banks are closing their doors overnight. People are standing outside with handwritten signs begging for work. Unemployment isn't just high, it has eaten through the fabric of entire communities. You wake up one morning, you turn on your radio, and you hear that the President of the United States has just signed an executive order. Executive Order 6102. And this order says something that if you told someone it could happen in America, they would have laughed at you before that morning. This order says that you, a private American citizen, are required by law to hand over your gold coins, your gold bars, your gold certificates, all of it. You must bring it to a Federal Reserve Bank by May 1st. If you refuse, you face a fine of $10,000, which in today's terms would be well over $200,000, and up to 10 years in federal prison for owning gold in America. The government called it hoarding. They dressed it up in the language of patriotism and emergency. They said the country needed your gold to stabilize the financial system. They said it was temporary. They said it was for the greater good. And so most Americans, terrified of the penalties and trusting their government in a time of crisis, did what they were told. They walked into those Federal Reserve branches. They handed over gold that their families had accumulated over generations, and they were paid the official price of $20.67 per ounce. Now, here is where the story goes from sad to infuriating. Almost exactly 9 months later, in January of 1934, President Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act. And buried inside that act was a single provision that changed everything. The official price of gold was revalued overnight from $20.67 per ounce to $35 per ounce. The government had just conjured up a 70% profit on gold that they had forced American citizens to surrender at the lower price. In one stroke of a pen, the federal government had engineered the largest legal wealth transfer in American history. The people who trusted their government, who followed the law, who handed over their gold, they were the ones who got wiped out. And the government, sitting on that mountain of confiscated gold, collected the windfall. Let that sink in for a moment. You turn in your gold at $20. 9 months later, the government reprices it at $35. You don't get the difference. You just get poorer. The government just gets richer. And the entire operation was dressed up as a national emergency measure. Now, why am I telling you this story today? Because I want you to look at the world around you right now. The headlines, the debt levels, the currency games, the geopolitical shifts, and tell me with a straight face that the conditions for a repeat are not lining up. Let's talk about what actually drove the 1933 confiscation, because it wasn't just about the Depression. The Depression was the cover story. The real driver was that the United States government had painted itself into a financial corner. They had made promises, obligations, that they could not keep while gold constrained how much money they could print. Gold was the thing standing in the way of the government's ability to inflate its way out of debt. So they removed it, they seized it, they repriced it, and then they used the newly inflated dollar supply to paper over their liabilities. Now let's look at today. The United States is carrying a level of national debt that would have been considered science fiction not long ago. We are talking about a number so large that if you spent $1 million a day, every single day, it would take you thousands of years to count through it. The interest payments alone on that debt now consume a greater portion of the federal budget than what is spent on national defense. We are in a debt spiral, And the only historical tools that governments have ever used to escape a debt spiral are inflate the currency, restructure the debt, or find a way to dramatically increase the value of their balance sheet assets. And what is the single largest hard asset on the United States government's balance sheet? Gold, sitting at Fort Knox and other depositories, officially carried on the books at a price that hasn't been meaningfully updated in decades. You heard me correctly. The United States government still officially values its gold reserves at a price per ounce that is completely disconnected from the market price of gold today. The gap between the official book value and the current market price represents a staggering amount of latent financial ammunition, wealth that the government could theoretically conjure into existence simply by revaluing the price of gold upward. Sound familiar? It should, because that is exactly what happened in 1934. Now, before I go any further, if you're watching this and you're thinking about your own retirement savings and wondering how people are actually protecting themselves right now, I put together a free guide on exactly that. It's in the description below. Thousands of American retirees have used these strategies to quietly shield their hard-earned wealth from what's coming. I'll come back to this later, but go check it out when you're done here. Back to the blueprint. Let's talk about the geopolitical dimension, because this is what gives the modern parallel its real teeth. In 1933, the threat to the dollar was internal. It was domestic banks failing, Americans hoarding gold, a system about to collapse from within. Today, the threat to the dollar is both internal and external, and the external threat is the one that most mainstream financial commentators are still not taking seriously enough. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and the growing list of countries that have joined or are seeking membership, have been engaged in a slow, methodical, and accelerating effort to reduce their dependence on the US dollar. This isn't conspiracy theory. This is being stated plainly by finance ministers and central bank governors in official communiques. Countries that once held their reserves primarily in US treasuries are diversifying. And what are they diversifying into? Gold. Central banks around the world have been buying gold at a pace that has broken record after record. Not quietly, not accidentally, systematically, deliberately. These are the institutions that have the most sophisticated economic intelligence operations on the planet. When the institution that manages Russia's reserves is buying gold, when the People's Bank of China is buying gold, when the Reserve Bank of India is buying gold, all simultaneously, all aggressively, you have to ask yourself a very serious question. What do they know that the average American retiree does not? What they know is that the dollar's reserve currency status is not a permanent condition of the universe. It is a historical arrangement, and historical arrangements end. The British pound was the world's reserve currency before the dollar, the Dutch guilder before that. Every reserve currency in history has eventually been displaced. Not always suddenly, sometimes slowly, sometimes in a way that takes decades to fully play out. But the direction of travel, once it begins, is unmistakable. And the direction of travel for the US dollar right now, being abandoned by central banks, being replaced in bilateral trade deals, being actively circumvented by new payment systems, is not upward. Here is the critical point. Every time a reserve currency has been displaced or weakened historically, the people who held their savings in that currency got hurt. And the people who held real assets, land, commodities, and above all gold, preserved their wealth across the transition. This is not speculation. This is the historical record, repeated across centuries and continents. The Roman citizen who held debased copper coins was destroyed. The one who held gold survived the fall. Now let's talk about what a modern version of the 1934 playbook might actually look like, because it wouldn't necessarily come in the form of men in suits knocking on your door. The government has far more sophisticated tools available today. Think about what a gold revaluation could accomplish from a purely accounting perspective. If the United States government officially repriced its gold holdings to reflect the actual market value, it would instantly create hundreds of billions of dollars of new balance sheet capacity. That doesn't require seizing anyone's gold, at least not in the first stage. It's a bookkeeping move, a stroke of a pen, just like 1934. But here's what follows a revaluation. Here's the second act of the play that most people never think about. Once you establish that the government has the power and the willingness to reprice gold, to use its control over monetary policy and currency value to manipulate the real purchasing power of private savings, you've opened a door that doesn't close easily. The citizens who saw gold as a store of value, as a hedge against exactly this kind of government financial engineering, suddenly become a problem. Because if gold is being repriced upward while private citizens hold it, then private citizens are capturing the benefit of that revaluation. And historically, governments in fiscal distress don't like watching private citizens capture benefits that could flow to the state instead. Think about the sequence in the 1930s one more time. First came the crisis, then came the executive order, then came the confiscation at the artificially low price, then came the revaluation at the higher price. The government captured the spread. The private citizens were left holding paper dollars that were worth less in real terms than the gold they had surrendered. Could the modern version be more subtle? Absolutely. A capital gains tax specifically targeting precious metals profits. Reporting requirements so onerous that holding physical gold becomes impractical. Legislation that makes gold-backed retirement accounts suddenly non-compliant. There are a dozen ways a modern government could effectively accomplish the same wealth transfer without the theatrical spectacle of door-to-door confiscation. And every single one of them requires that you be holding your gold in a form that the government can see, track, and access. Which brings us to a critical distinction about how you hold your precious metals exposure. And this is exactly why the most sophisticated investors aren't just buying gold. They're thinking about where and how they hold it. Because the 1934 playbook works on gold that is easily identifiable and accessible. It does not work nearly as well on gold that is properly structured within certain legal frameworks. The people who survived the 1933 order relatively intact were the ones who either had gold in certain exempt categories, rare coins for instance, which were explicitly excluded from the confiscation order, or who had structured their holdings in ways that the broad executive order didn't reach. Now let's talk about the institutional picture, because what the big money is doing right now is the most important tell in this entire story. We've talked about central banks, but let's go deeper. The COMEX, the primary exchange where gold futures contracts are traded, has been under an unusual and mounting strain. The ratio of paper gold contracts to actual deliverable physical gold has been running at levels that raise serious structural questions about the integrity of the market. For every ounce of actual gold sitting in COMEX registered vaults, there are many multiples of that in outstanding contracts that theoretically represent claims on that same gold. This is not a secret, it's in the public data, and the implication is profound. The price of gold that you see quoted on your screen every day is being determined primarily by the trading of paper contracts, not by the exchange of physical metal. The tail is wagging the dog. What happens when that changes? What happens when a critical mass of contract holders demands delivery? What happens when the gap between the paper price and the price of actual physical gold in your hand becomes impossible to maintain? The answer, historically, is a violent repricing upward. The paper price catches up to the physical reality. And in that moment, the people who are holding physical gold or properly structured gold-backed assets see their positions revalued dramatically upward, while the people who thought they owned gold through ETFs or futures contracts discover that what they actually owned was a promise, and promises can be broken, renegotiated, settled in cash, or restructured away. Here's something that almost nobody is talking about. The London Bullion Market Association, the LBMA, which governs the most important over-the-counter gold trading market in the world, operates on a system that is far less transparent than most investors realize. The vast majority of gold transactions in London are not the movement of physical metal at all. They are entries in a ledger, unallocated gold accounts where multiple parties have claims on the same pool of metal. It is, functionally, a form of fractional reserve banking applied to gold. And just like fractional reserve banking in the currency system, it works perfectly well, right up until the moment that it doesn't, until the moment too many people want their physical gold at the same time. At that point, the entire edifice becomes a problem of enormous proportions. Here is something that really puts the 1934 parallel in sharp focus. In the years leading up to FDR's executive order, there had been significant bank runs. People were pulling their money out of banks because they didn't trust the system. They were converting their dollars into gold because gold was real and dollars might not be tomorrow. The government's response to this perfectly rational behavior, this perfectly understandable act of self-preservation by ordinary citizens, was to criminalize it, to call it hoarding, to make the act of protecting your own savings a federal offense. Now look at what happens every time there is a financial stress event today. Every time markets get volatile, every time some new geopolitical shock hits, what do you see? A surge in demand for physical gold and silver. Coin dealers sell out, premiums spike, the mint can't keep up with orders. Ordinary people, doing the same rational thing their great-grandparents did in 1933, trying to get their savings into something real, are flooding into precious metals. And what is the official narrative every single time? That this is irrational, that this is panic, that this is hoarding. The language hasn't changed. The playbook hasn't changed. Only the actors have. Let's talk about the supply side of this equation, because there's something happening in silver markets specifically that deserves serious attention. Silver is both a monetary metal and an industrial metal, and the industrial demand for silver has been exploding. Solar panels, electric vehicles, advanced electronics, defense applications, all of these industries consume silver at rates that are straining the available supply. The silver market has been running a structural supply deficit, meaning more silver is being consumed than is being mined for multiple consecutive years. And yet the price of silver for most of this period has been held in a range that made no fundamental sense given the supply picture. The suppression of silver prices through paper markets has allowed industrial consumers to access cheap silver at the expense of private investors who held physical silver expecting the market to reflect basic supply and demand realities. This cannot continue indefinitely. The laws of supply and demand are not optional. When the disconnect between the paper price and the physical market finally resolves, and it will resolve, it always does, the movement in silver is likely to be dramatic. More dramatic than gold, because silver's market is smaller and the supply deficit is acute. The same investors who watched gold's rise have been quietly building silver positions precisely because of this dynamic. Now, I want to bring this back to something personal, because everything I've just described, the debt spiral, the institutional buying, the COMEX strain, the historical blueprint for 1934, the de-dollarization trend, all of it converges on a single question that matters for your specific situation. And that question is, what happens to the retirement savings that you have spent your entire working life building if the dollar undergoes a significant devaluation? What happens to your 401k, your IRA, your pension, if the government decides that the path out of its debt crisis runs through the printing press? Because that's what happened in 1934. The people who had paper savings, government bonds, bank deposits, dollar-denominated assets, woke up one day to discover that their purchasing power had been dramatically eroded, not because of market forces, because of a policy decision. Here's where a gold IRA becomes one of the most important conversations you can have right now, because one of the lessons of 1934 that gets buried in the history books is that not everyone was wiped out. The people who held rare coins, specifically certain collectible gold coins, were explicitly exempt from the confiscation order. And today, there are IRS-approved structures that allow Americans to hold physical precious metals inside a retirement account, a self-directed IRA, in a way that combines the tax advantages of traditional retirement savings with the inflation protection and wealth preservation properties of real gold. If you have $100,000 or more in a qualifying retirement account, you may be able to move a portion of it into physical gold and silver without triggering a taxable event. The gold goes into an approved depository. It's yours. It's allocated. It's not a paper promise. And it's inside a structure that has specific legal protections. If you want to understand exactly how this works, that free guide I mentioned earlier is in the description below. It walks through the mechanics step by step. Back to the macro picture, because there's one more piece of this puzzle that I want to make sure you understand, because it's the piece that ties everything together. We talked about how in 1934, the government's ability to execute the gold confiscation and revaluation depended on one thing above all else: a financial emergency that had frightened the public into compliance. People were scared. They were desperate. They wanted someone, anyone, to fix things. And in that environment of fear and desperation, they were willing to accept policies that they never would have accepted in normal times. Executive Order 6102 would have been politically impossible in 1929. It was only possible in 1933 because the crisis had already been underway for years and people had been worn down. Now look at the financial stress building in the system today. The banking sector has shown periodic vulnerabilities that remind seasoned observers of the warning signs that preceded previous crises. Commercial real estate portfolios at regional banks are carrying losses that have not been fully recognized. The derivatives markets, the complex financial instruments that large institutions use to hedge their exposures, are running at notional levels that dwarf anything that existed before the 2008 financial crisis. And the Federal Reserve, which is supposed to be the backstop for all of this, is itself operating with a balance sheet that would have been considered inconceivably bloated a generation ago. This is not a system operating from a position of strength. This is a system operating from a position of extreme fragility, held together by confidence, by the collective belief that the people managing it know what they're doing, and that the promises embedded in the financial system will ultimately be honored. Confidence is a brittle thing. It can sustain a system for a surprisingly long time, and then it can evaporate with terrifying speed. The historical record is unambiguous on this point. Every major currency crisis in history, every hyperinflation, every devaluation, every confiscation, was preceded by a period in which the system appeared to be functioning, in which the official reassurances seemed credible, in which the warnings from the minority who saw the fragility were dismissed as alarmism. And then the confidence broke, and everything changed very fast. The people who had real assets, gold, silver, productive land, tangible stores of value, navigated those transitions, sometimes with great difficulty, but they navigated them. The people who had only paper claims, currency, bonds, bank deposits, promises, often found those claims renegotiated, inflated away, defaulted on, or simply stolen. This is not politics. This is not theory. This is the historical pattern across civilizations, centuries, and continents. Let me leave you with this. The most expensive thing in the world is not gold. It's not silver. It's not real estate. The most expensive thing in the world is what you have to pay to learn a lesson the hard way, when you had every opportunity to learn it for free. The people who lost their gold savings in 1933 didn't lose them because they were uninformed or reckless. They lost them because they trusted the system at exactly the wrong moment, because they assumed that what had always worked, keeping your savings in conventional, government-approved forms, would continue to work. They assumed the rules wouldn't change. The rules can always change. They changed overnight in 1933. They changed when Nixon closed the gold window in 1971. They changed in Cyprus in 2013, when the government literally took money directly out of bank accounts to fund a bailout. The rules always look stable and permanent right up until the moment they don't. And the people who had prepared for that moment, who held real assets outside the system, who understood that gold's entire purpose is to be the thing that survives when the official promises fail, those people moved through those transitions in a fundamentally different position than everyone else. We are not in normal times. The debt levels, the geopolitical realignment, the institutional gold buying, the strain in the paper markets, the historical parallel to 1934. None of this is normal. None of this is background noise. Something large is being set in motion, and the window to position yourself ahead of it, rather than in the middle of it, is not infinite. If you watched this far, here's something I want to give you. In the description below is a link to a free guide I put together. It covers the specific strategies that thousands of American retirees are using right now to protect their wealth, including how gold IRAs actually work, what the IRS allows, and how to get started without making costly mistakes. But there's also something else. If you're an American retiree with at least $100,000 in any qualifying retirement account, a 401k, an IRA, a 403b, a pension, and you want to go deeper than a guide, if you want someone to actually walk you through what this looks like for your specific situation, mention that you watched this video when you contact us, and you'll be eligible for a free, exclusive, no-obligation, one-on-one educational web conference. Not a sales pitch, not a scripted presentation, an actual conversation about your actual situation with someone who understands this landscape. That offer is for people who made it to the end. That's you. The link is in the description. The year 1934 was not inevitable. People had warning signs. They had time. They just didn't have the framework to understand what those warning signs meant. You have the framework now. What you do with it is up to you.